Greetings hobbyists, this is Artisans of Wool, and in this video we're talking about a 3D print prep workflow. So I've been designing this recently and it's a fairly complex object. It's also pretty big, which means I've got a couple of things to deal with. For example, this bottom bit, minus the trim, is going to be printed in plastic, whereas all these central bits are going to be printed in resin. And this should just about fit on my resin printer, but this larger bit wouldn't. So I need to start bringing this together because I want to start test printing it and making sure everything works while I'm designing the larger bit that's going to be at the bottom here. Now, what we're going to do is go through how I'm going to work through this because I actually want to do the hollowing out of this object in Blender instead of in a 3D slicing piece of software, because I actually want it to be properly hollow, like a shell without a bottom to it where resin could get trapped. Just because I think it's going to be easier, and I also need to put in the key and lock points where it's going to join into this bottom section. So I thought this would be an interesting video. Now, just one thing before we start, I've actually made this so it's going to boolean together really nicely by just giving a little bit of overlap. For example, we can see on, let's say, this object, there's a bit of overlap there. These are actually full parts that go inside, so is that. And even on the smaller bits, let's say this little hatch, if we come into isolation mode and look slide on, you can see there's a little bit of overlap there. So this is just going to go together quite nicely. So that's something to think through. Now, before we begin, I need to prep some bits for this hollowing process. And again, you might not normally do this, but I think it's an interesting workflow for something this big. And that is that these two bits here, and you'll notice again, I've made them so that they're not in line perfectly, and I'll deal with that bit later. But what I want to do is make sure that these can be cut out and not have little bits of problem, let's put it that way. Firstly, let's go into vertex mode. You can see that this is already divided into quarters. If you haven't got that, just do something like J to join it, or you could use the knife tool. But we want this in quarters to speed things up in this instance. And I don't want to worry about these bits sticking out here. So I'm just going to get the knife tool K, go to there, and then do the same thing on this side. And I'm being a bit approximate with that. Let's go into face mode. I'm going to separate this face. So that's Shift and D, and then I'm just going to Z, and I'll bring it down just a tiny bit, just to make it easier to see in the future. And that's P, and separate that by loose parts. And then I'm going to probably inset this, I think. Yeah, let's try that. No, maybe not. If I just S to scale this, that could work, but it's a bit of an odd angle. Let's just bring that in there to somewhere about here. So this is about the thickness that I want these walls. And then we're just going to need to go into edge mode, select that edge there, Shift and S, bring my cursor to that edge. And then once again in object mode, I'm going to use the cursor so that when I can S and then Y, no, X, there we go, I can just shrink it in just on the X axis. Oh no, this still wants to shrink in all directions. Well, that's annoying, but anyway, let's just merge that together, and we can just G and then use Y, again using that cursor to bring that out to somewhere there. There we go. So that seems fine. So we've got this. Now we'll just rename this. I'm going to F2 and call this hollow 1, because we're going to need another hollow section, and we'll do the same thing for this. Let's go into face mode there, and I'm actually going to use machine tools and just hit 4, which makes that vastly faster. So let's just G and set that down again, so we're sort of just well out of the way and clear of everything else that we're doing. And then F2, and we'll call that hollow 2. And we don't need to really worry about those for now, so let's just select that one, and we'll just H to hide them, and we'll come back to those later. Right. So let's start booleaning together. I'm going to whiz through this really quickly just in the background, but just to give some pointers. Firstly, for objects that are going to have a lot of weird overlap. So for example, this object here needs to be boolean to this, but so do these. Trying to select those and then that can cause some problems. So do it just sequentially. So I'm going to select this bit, click, and then I'm going to press Control Shift and plus. So it just does it without creating a modifier and me having to do everything twice. And then I can select all of these which have no overlap with themselves, and then Control Shift and plus. Similarly over here, I've got this, these which are mirrored, and that which is mirrored. So I'm just going to apply the mirrors. I'm using hard ops for that to speed that up. And then let's boolean those to those, boolean those to those, and then this to the door, and then door to here, and then this to there. And you can see this is really quick once you start doing that. Anyway, I'm going to whiz through all the rest of this because otherwise it's just going to be really tedious and take too long. So I don't think it's any benefit me showing you a slow Boolean process. Okay, so I think that should be everything at this point. Let's just /, there we go. Yep, all good to go. And I always like to do a quick 3D print check because you get errors as you make things and sometimes you might not have spotted them. So let's go to Edit Preferences just to show where this is. Go to Get Extensions, type in 3D Print, and you want this 3D Print toolbox. You'll have an Install button just like this one below, so install it, and then you'll be good to go. We can N and come to our 3D Print checker. Let's check all, and we'll see how many errors we've got. We're bound to get some because there'll be some sort of minor error. In fact, there's a big error. Let's just go into vertex mode and see where those are. Maybe there's some faces on there. Anyway, let's just clean that up. And there we go. That's fixed that all. No problem there. Oh, I didn't join those together. Missed that one. So Control Shift and plus, and we should be good to go. Now, I need this to be perfectly flat to fit on this. So similar thing, I'm going to select this face here, separate that with machine tools, and then A and then E to extrude that down somewhere there. So we've now got this to cut out of it. The shading for this looks a little off, so I always recommend actually keeping your face orientation on when you're doing this. And yeah, we can see my face orientation is basically the wrong way round. Yours will probably be red, but as I have my normal shading as red, I've changed mine to yellow. So that's up to you what color you go with. Let's just go into vertex mode for this. Shift and N, A and Shift and N even, and then that's sorted that out. We should be able to click there, Control Shift and minus, and that should cut that out. And we're all good to go. There we go, come out of isolation mode. Now, we just want this now and our hollowing bit. So let's bring our two hollows, and then we've clicked on this, and we need to use Control to select those, and then isolate. Now, we've got a slight issue here in that these are, well, too far down. So this is actually going to be a little bit off on sizing. We've got the right thickness of our walls. In fact, do I want my walls that thick? Let's just go to somewhere there-ish. I think that'll work. That's why this was scaling weird. I haven't got the scale set. So Control and A and scale. And then all I'm going to do is just extrude this up, I think. So vertex mode, A, E to get that to about the right point. So about that thick. And once again, we've got that same problem. So Shift and N. And then we'll scale in this top. So let's just go to face mode there, and then just S and get to the point where we're approximately happy, and then we'll have a look at this a little bit better. Okay, so that seems to be thick enough there, probably not thick enough there, so let's just GG and bring that along a bit. I'd rather be safe than sorry. And what have I done here? I've scaled that in here, so let's just select those. I'm just going to G, B for snap base there. I'm going to Shift and Z so it doesn't change on the Z axis, and go there so this lines up now. There we go. So this should be good to go. Now we're going to need to mirror this. That's why we've got it into quarters earlier. I'm going to use hard dots for this. So Alt and X, Shift click there, and then click there. You can use a normal mirror if you want to. We need that merge clicked on, which should be working, but we're going to have a problem. Let's just isolate this, go into vertex mode. That we've got these faces. So actually let's just, edge mode will be easier. We can X, delete that edge there, and then this should be good to go. So now we can come to our bits here and just click, Control and minus, and that should hollow that out. There we go. And we've got this bit that's a bit wider there. Do I have a problem with that? Maybe. Let's go into vertex mode, and then just G. We've still got that set to cursor, so I should be able to Y and just bring that forward a little bit. There we go, somewhere about there. There we go. So that hollowing's worked really nicely, and we're about the right thickness on all of our walls. Let's H to hide that. Now we need to hollow out the rest of it. So let's come to our hollow 2. So that's out of isolation mode. Select this and hollow 2, isolation mode. And we're going to do exactly the same thing again, but now we need to make space for these doorways. So let's A, S to scale this in until we're at the right point. So about that thickness. And let's just G and Z that up so it's pretty close. A, E to extrude that up to about there. S to scale it in. That looks about right. Oh, that has not done that uniformly. Right, if we have a look at this, what's the easiest way to show this? Probably here. You can see that the gap here is way bigger than the gap there. Right, so why is that? Let's just isolate this object and we can talk about why that is. And it's basically that this works off of, or when you scale, it has a bit of a weighting to it sometimes. And these extra vertices here are causing this problem. So let's just go back a bit. And we're just going to get rid of these vertices. So Control and X to dissolve them out. And then this should work fine. So let's just once again, E to extrude that up. It's gone too far, so let's just bring that back down somewhere about there. And then S. And this should be way more uniform. And there we go. That looks pretty good, but it's still slightly off. Let's just G and let's just come out of cursor to global and just G and Y that up a little bit. And we need to scale that in a little bit more. There we go. Okay, so that should do fine. So A, Shift and N to sort out the fact that this is the wrong way round, and then we're just going to cut out these bits for where the doors are going to be, because otherwise we're not going to be able to see the doors. So let's just use box cutter, Alt and W. Let's go into X-ray mode. Something there. That works. W coming out to box cutter, and then just Q, ever scroll, because I've got hard ops, and then we will just Shift and S, put our cursor to the origin, and then change this to move around the cursor. Shift and D, R, and then 90, and then Shift and R, and then Shift and R. So now we've got 4 of these, and we just need to boolean the last ones out. So there, and there from our cutout. So Control and minus, and we've got this ready to go. That's H and H and H and H. And then we can just cut this from this, so Control and minus. So from this point, we're pretty good to go. So we've got this hollowed out. Now, what I do want to do though, let's H this and H this, is add in some supports for this. This is resin, and it will have a tendency to flex. I also want to have some good ways of connecting it to its base plate, and having some things towards the center would be a really sensible idea. So how are we going to deal with this? Right, what I want to do is just make some shapes that are going to be effectively our supports. So let's just come in here. So I'm just going to Shift A, mesh, and bring in a cube. Let's think about how wide I want these supports to be. Let's go 5 millimeters. And then I'm just going to S and then Y and just scale that up a lot. Let's just S and Z to do the same thing there. And then let's just bring this in place, so G and Z, so it's somewhere here. Let's just take this off so I can't see my face orientation. It's getting a bit messy. Right, so that should work. Then I want one support there. Let's Shift and D and R and 90. I want another support there. And once again, I'm just going to G and Z that up so that there's not a perfect overlap there. It just makes things a little bit easier. And select both of those, Shift and D, and then R, and then 45. And we're going to have a support running down the middle here, I think, as well. And then let's just G and Z that up as well. So these are going to be our supports, which should work holding everything in place. So let's just join these together. So there, and there. Control and plus, and then we'll just H to hide all of the ones that we don't need. And then with this created, what I can do is Q, ever scroll, bring back the cutter, and then select this, Shift select this, Control and minus, and then we're going to cut the supports out of the bit that's hollowing it. So we get the supports there. But this hasn't worked very nicely, because if you remember, there's actually 2 cutters working on this. So we're going to have a slight annoyance. So what I'm going to do, and this is one thing that's a little bit annoying with the way these cutters work, I always find them difficult to get multiple ones of these visible at the same time, is we're just going to Alt and H to bring back everything, and then click, click Control and minus for that as well. And then we've got those appearing for both of them. Then we can just H and then H and then H. So with that done, we should now have no problems, but we've also really significantly cut down the amount of resin we're going to be creating, but we've got more control than doing this in our slicer. Next up, I want to add some points that are going to be, well, basically connecting this to the base section so that everything slots together. So let's just, where's my cursor? It's all the way down there. Let's just come here, Shift and S and cursor 2 selected, and Shift and A, mesh, and bring in a cube. So we'll stick with 4mm, so there's a little bit less thickness. And then I'm just going to S and then Y to bring that out somewhere there. And then I'm just going to go into face mode. No, I'm not. I'm going to Control and A and apply the scale, then go into face mode, and then just S to scale that face in. So this is always worth doing. And then let's just S and then X and scale that in a bit more there, because we don't ever want anything too flat. Let's just G and then Y that across. So we'll have that all the way out here. And then I think I want this on multiple edges. So let's just keep that on the 3D cursor, Shift and D, R, and then Z, and then 45, and then Shift and R. So we've got one of those on each of those sections. Now I could have done that with a circular array, but this is just fine. Let's just G and Z that up so that there's a little bit of an overlap, and that should be good to go. Do I want any on these endpoints? Possibly. Let's just G, put one here. Let's scale it down, not on the 3D cursor. So let's just do one there. Yep, that should be good. Oh, no, it shouldn't. I just took the one that was meant to be there. Let's duplicate it and do the same thing again. So scale that down, G, and then Z that to there. And that should be a good connection point. Let's just Shift and D and then YY, no, XX, and bring another one over here. Yep, and then change that to 3D cursor, Shift and D, R, Z, and then 90, and then Shift and R, Shift and R. So all of these are going to be our keys. So the easiest thing to do here is just to select all of those. Let's just M and move that to a new collection. We'll call that keys and create that. And then now we can sort that collection out really easily. And what we're going to do is Shift and D all of those. Then we're going to M and move those to a new collection, and we'll call these locks. And then we're going to hide the key section, keep all the locks section. So selecting everything in there, going to vertex mode A, and then turning this to individual origins. We're just going to scale these up slightly. So let's just S, and each of these is going to get scaled up a bit to make the hole that this is going to go into. And we need this little bit of overlap. Let's just bring back the keys. If we have a look at those in X-ray mode, so that they fit into each other nicely. So this is really important. If we don't have this, this is going to be an absolute nightmare. So let's just hide the locks. We've got all of these, so we've got all the keys. We'll select all of those. So let's just click here, Control and plus. So we've got all of those joined to that. And then if we come out of isolation mode, we've got loads of stuff still visible there. Let's just H that. Oh, that's because I unhid everything earlier. I'll leave that for now. It's not going to be a problem. And then we're going to come into this. So there, and then Control, and then Shift, and that. So then isolation mode. And then we can cut out all of these from our big section here. So Control and minus. And this means that we've now got the exact placement of all of these holes. Let's change that to fast from our base object. So now this will 3D print really nicely with our holes, and then we can just join the two together. So there we go. Pretty easy. Now obviously I've got a bit to do here. I'm going to need to do the same for these bits onto the base section, and I'm going to separate this out a bit because it's got loads and loads of rivets on it, and that's not going to print in for FDM plastic very nicely. So I'll separate those bits out and then divide these into sections, and they'll be resin, and then they will attach to this larger plastic bit. But basically everything here should stabilize each other, and I should be using the best material for each part. The bits that are high detail are going to be in resin, and the bits that are low detail but need to be more supporting are going to be in FDM plastic. So hopefully this should work out quite well. Anyway, that's my thought process behind this. I just need to start exporting this. So if I just isolate this here, we're just going to file, export STL, and change this to selection only, and then I can start exporting these STLs and getting them printed. Anyway, a little bit of a different bit of content here, very much 3D printing focused, but hopefully it showed you some good ideas of how you can manage this yourself. If you're going to want any of these files, they're going to be available on the Patreon, as they always are, at the 3D design file tier, or there is a lower cost supporter tier for a few dollars where you get these videos ad-free and a week early and access to the channel Discord. So I hope to see you in the next video, and have a great day.